There's a lot of that in Hayek, who we'll be discussing today.
Good. I don't know much about Hayek.
He's very interested in the history of the ideas of liberty and justice and function of legislation, because he feels that it's gone quite wrong in the modern age, and we've got a lot of confusion about these ideas, and he's trying to iron that out. And the history is very important for him to do that. And he also leveled a lot of his criticisms at seeing some very pervasive ideologies that were being diffused with all the governments in Europe and in the US. So he has a very broad historical scope, as it were.
Does he have an idea what right is? So he thinks it's gone wrong.
Yeah.
So he has a
yes, he does.
framework.
Yeah. So he has a few ideas. A return to an authentic constitutional liberalism, which he does put forward in a small chapter in this book. I mean, the whole book is about setting up the theory behind what that model constitution will look like, and then he distills it, very much emphasising that it's a model, not something that could just be applied. One of the most important ideas is the separation of the function of legislation and function of government. So legislation is to do with articulating the rules of just conduct, he calls them. So these are implicit rules which govern how we all act. They have an implicit evolutionary history for Hayek, and they're universalizable. And so they aren't so interested in individual interests serving individual groups. It has to be universalizable. And he doesn't want that contaminated with the government role, which is much more about particular interest. It's about distributing what resources are given to government, allocating certain positions, certain projects, and so forth. So we'll see all that anyway. Right. So
let's get started, I'd say.
Great. So we've got, we're already recording. Great. Okay, well, thank you all for coming this evening to the fifth of our liberty theories. We're going to do Hayek tonight, that I've just been mentioning. We did the French existentialist previously, and there's some overlap because there's a key interest in how to avoid totalitarianism, and in relation to that, a return to a certain idea of negative liberty. But I think we'll also find some disagreement, particularly on the issue of justice, though I will be careful not to occupy too much time with justice. This is a series on liberty. Okay. So Hayek is one of the foremost economists of the last century. He's a Viennese economist, born to a family deeply invested in academia and in scientific research. So it was very natural for him to begin his career as a statistician. Around that same time, he becomes enrolled in the university there, the University of Vienna, and he would lecture on economics. And then shortly after, he migrated to the University of London, where he held the Tuck Chair between 1931 and 1950. He would ultimately hold tenureships at various other universities across Europe and America, including, I think, the University of Freiburg, I think the one in Chicago, and maybe Pennsylvania. There's some very big American names that come up, so quite a distinguished career. He didn't stop lecturing until around the 70s, and then he published this in retirement. This was written between 73 and 78, so that's Law, Legislation and Liberty. Okay, so during his time at the University of London, if not LSE, I thought that the LSE used to be University of London. I've since found that they are distinct universities, and the University of London is just across the street, tucked away. So it's like this. So during his time at the University of London, he began to write critically against the practicality and morality of centrally planned economies, such as those that were emerging in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, France, the UK as well, and in America under FDR. The Road to Serfdom is his first major work, and this is where he distills quite prominent criticisms against these ideas, which will recur through all of his subsequent writings. including our fundamental ignorance of the whole of the economic system, which occupies a central place, because if you don't know the whole of the economy, you've really got to have a very hands-off approach to how you interact with it and how you legislate around it. One key reason he's critical of distributive justice and similar notions is because so interference comes with untold consequences. He discusses in that book also the incompatibility of central planning and liberty, and the incompatibility of servicing particular interests with the ideals of justice, which are general. To give some examples of the incompatibility of central planning and liberty, which we can expand on a little bit throughout our conversation tonight, the idea of interfering with prices, which are for Hayek price signals. Hayek believes that this interference will prevent people from being able to plan for their future, because prices give you an honest reflection of the integrated complex whole of the economy, which is very much for any individual, something they have only an abstract notion of.
There you go. They're buzzing around the front door there.
Great, I'll let you.
Climb through the window.
I usually make Jack do this, or don't.
So the basic idea is, if you interfere with the price, the organic price changes, as it were, you no longer enable people a genuine insight into how things are changing, and so they don't know where to put their money and where to invest their time, and therefore their liberty is exposed. He also talks a bit about the risk of losing one's freedom to choose your employment, the risk of products being standardized, so you no longer get alternatives to products. He talks also about not being able to negotiate with suppliers your particular demands for what a product might look like. So all of these are the ways in which the centralization of economics can look against liberty, as Hayek argues. Hi, good to see you.
Sorry.
No worries. We've just started. I've just introduced Hayek as the great Viennese economist, and I just mentioned about the role of serfdom in his first major text. Okay, so you can see from the outset, he established himself as a vehement critic of ideas that we would mainly associate with socialism and various forms of government surrounding that, which have continued to dominate politics in various ways. Some more subtle than others. I think he'd be aware of that inroad to serfdom, because his audience would not have necessarily recognised the way in which the UK government was approaching a centralised economy in certain aspects, and some of the things he puts in that book are quite staggering to his audience. The following year, 1945, he publishes a small book, I think, very great essay, where he distills his critique of centralised planning just on the principle of distinguishing two kinds of knowledge: scientific knowledge, which you can sort of know as an abstract rule and exactly how it will apply. It's a kind of deterministic knowledge, and this sort of implicit practical knowledge, which must necessarily be distributed, because no single entity can have the whole of the picture. So the advantage of a decentralized economy for Hayek is precisely that. You need to just let people get on with their lives and make their transactions, because it's by them freely responding to changes in their sort of small framing of the whole of the economy that the economy perpetuates itself. It's a self-generating, self-maintaining structure, because people are allowed the freedom to respond to changes in their world, and people respond to them, and so on. No one gets the whole of that in one go. So this is the importance of price signals, namely that they hide the complexity of the market from each individual. So you're able to, because of a price, you're able to infer what's going on without knowing why. If my fuel goes up, I know that there's been a relative supply-demand change. I don't need to know why. I just need to know that it has happened. So this is the basic principle, which Hayek identified as the primary need to maintain a decentralized economy. He gives the name for the kind of philosophy that wants to build it. Yeah.
By decentralized, I mean not central planning.
Yes, yes. So.
And if that isn't central planning, like the UK, for example, would be decentralized.
Yes, yes, precisely. So you don't want the government to start trying to determine the perfect price for things through time or to gather up all that information. I mean, there's so many practical limitations, but this is here Hayek trying to get to a more principled objection to centralized planning, namely the fact of our fundamental ignorance and basically the idea that the economy is a kind of thing that is effective because it is distributed. A constructed thing, a purely rational thing. He calls it rational constructivism, and he identifies with it, and also an epistemic problem.
Sorry, about the like decentralized government, what's that got to do with distributing?
Because the objective of the centralized government economically is to redistribute. Because a centralized government will tend to see the world as a series of problems which exist because we don't have the full picture. And if we could just get the full picture and mathematically, scientifically determine who is owed what for particular purposes, then all of our inequalities would disappear, all of our wants would be serviced, and all of this.
Echoing Burke, isn't it, in many ways, in terms of when we were discussing the kind of gridization of France.
Yes, yes.
And the idea that Paris can somehow cut up the nation into these small blocks and decide what's going to be distributed to them on a kind of level playing field, rather than actually looking at what's going on the ground. So I suppose he'd say that local authorities, if he was living in our day and our politics, which he's not, obviously there were local authorities, but he's probably even going further, isn't he, in saying actually businesses, organisations know what is best in that area.
Precisely, yeah. So you'll see in law liberty and legislation an exaltation of the primary role of local government, of businesses, of individuals in determining their own affairs, because there are all kinds of practical and ethical problems for Hayek when the government tries to intervene for the sake of a hypothetical perfection and tell everyone what they ought to be aiming for, what is and is not in their remit, not just legally speaking, but in terms of where they can spend their money and what occupations they can interest themselves with. Okay. Now the big volume from which our excerpts have come. This is 3 volumes, but they've happily printed it in one for us now. He wrote it. What an active time this was, the 1970s. You have 3 major publications: John Rawls, The Theory of Justice, a seminal text, which we'll be studying on Thursday. That'll be our Thursday seminar. It would have been in a week's time if we had been able to do this seminar. We've got an omnibus week. Okay. You've also got Robert Nozick, Anarchy, Utopia and the State, and Michael Oakeshott on Human Nature, all within like three years of each other. So in the middle of this is when Hayek starts to write this and finishes in 1978. He's primarily responding to Rawls. I think he was quite fond of Nozick's book. I'm not so familiar with the details of these books. Are you familiar with them, Sam?
Well, Rawls, yes, in terms of what we'll be discussing on Thursday, and we'll be bouncing off of Nozick a little bit. I mean, Nozick is essentially a classical liberal transposed into the modern time. He takes Locke's ideas and believes that even your own body is your own property because you've worked your body, so therefore, he says that essentially it's universalizable, everything can be property if you so desire, and there shouldn't be this kind of emotive idea of an individual in terms of essentially about treating the individual with rights and things like that. Obviously they should have rights, but very much focused around property rights. Everything is property. Oakeshott is kind of the one nation conservative writer of the 70s, talking about steering the ship of conservatives. Steering the ship of government should be the aim of true conservatism, to kind of move it out of the way of the icebergs of historical consequences. If there's the only thing the government should do is respond to situations rather than be planning. So obviously that fits in somewhat with the general idea.
Yeah.
And obviously Rules is on the other end of the spectrum. He's a very much a modern liberal and will be very much bouncing off of where we sat when we were discussing Mill into what Rules is saying, because Rules is the other end of the spectrum to everything we've discussed before, criticised by liberals for being a social democrat, but criticised by socialists for being a kind of liberal, for being a liberal.
Great.
And obviously they're all coming out of a period of massive tumult. 1968, the year that France could have gone red, and the possibility of there being kind of these sort of revolutions across Europe. So they're all in that milieu of wanting to try and map out a path of how do we stabilise our nations.
Indeed, Hayek himself is also addressing that.
Yeah.
A lot of the later chapters in this book are in response to the decline in faith in democracy, as it were. And Hayek sees it as his task to try and reinstill that faith. But part of what he's going to do in this work is correct many false assumptions, he believes, about what democracy is, what it should look like institutionally, what justice is, what liberty is.
So does he? So he's saying, if I understand it correctly, that the central government should stay out of messing around with market forces, messing around with presumably social dynamics and so on. What is he saying government should be doing? What's his possible proposal?
It should primarily concern itself with two things. First of all, the legislative branch should be getting on with articulating what he calls rules of just conduct. So these are laws that reflect this implicit structure of society, which Hayek argues are always universalizable, meaning that they admit of an indefinite amount of instances to which they could be applied, and they're taking into account general interests only, not particular interests. So it's not a law that gives an advantage to this particular group over that particular group. I believe that is intrinsically unjust. It's not laws about what ought to go to this person or to that person or to this group, but what people could reasonably expect to be provided for by government or by justice systems if certain conditions are met. So it's very general. It really emphasises that. The government branch, the government assembly, is distinct from the legislative assembly and is trying to administer resources. And it has a bit more flexibility to do things with particular interests in mind. First of all, because it has a mandate, presumably from people, about particular things that they're concerned about. Second, because it's an organisation, not a spontaneous order, like the whole of society and culture is, in Hayek's view. It's the spontaneity of society or the spontaneity of the economy, which means that you've got to really have this hands-off approach, because you just do not understand what that is. Whereas you do understand what the government is, because you've made it by the constitution. You've sort of enumerated the principles which specify the division of powers and what it can and cannot do, and the extent of its judicial reach, and so on. So,
but sure, and it feels like he's saying certain things are not the business of central government.
yes,
Other things are the business of central government, and they're universalizable.
yes,
But the first set is not, because they're not universal. It seems to me like an arbitrary distinction.
yes. It's
And it sounds like he has this perspectiveless view of all of this, where he can work out which activities should be in which category. And that doesn't feel very.
This is a very good point. I'd like to discuss this some more, because
we
were just talking about the more I was reading, the less I understood this distinction between general and particular. So, for instance, how does tax bracketing fit in? You divide people up. Is that particular groups? Is that particular interests? I don't think Hayek would have anything against. I mean, on the contrary, Sam told me about what's called a poll bill or something.
Well, the poll tax,
The
yeah,
poll tax from the 80s, which was a flat tax on everyone. And Hayek would see that is unjust because you can't place the same expectations on people financially. So the government has this ability to accommodate the people in a consistent manner. So that I guess the spirit of Hayek's argument is that the government should aim for consistency, should aim to do things which are predictable and which enables people to act and plan for the long term. And what he sees with a lot of the movements towards social justice, for instance, and such terms, redistributive justice, is quite arbitrary corrections which are unpredictable and to which there could be no end to people applying to the government for.
But the lack of corrections leaves you with forces that people don't necessarily understand, which are also unpredictable. So it doesn't feel like predictability is actually his aim. His aim is to get government out of making decisions of a certain kind that he's chosen they shouldn't be in. I'm seeing arbitrariness in his categories.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to talk about this some more. I think that'll be a very important point of discussion. I'll quickly finish a broader overview. One of the major disagreements with people like Rawls is the idea that the economy, the society as a whole, is rationally constructed. The criticism I mentioned before. So Hayek really buys into a certain empiricism about man, anthropologically speaking. You have this quote: "Man acted before he sought, and did not understand before he acted." So it's sort of the trial by error vision of man, and so you've got all these implicit things that you can't keep track of. Have I discussed that? Yeah. We could have in no time had the knowledge sufficient to produce a successful state. Political institutions like culture must be self-generating, must have arisen organically according to just conduct. He envisions that these will come into action through natural selection. Talk a bit more about how he derives that. The state, as I've said, has to articulate these rules. Specifically, the legislature has to do that and keeps that distinct. Bit about the universalizability of the rules. For society to work for each individual, it must have this internal consistency. This internal consistency will remind its legislators of the interests of particular groups. Universalizable religious conduct such as property rights and religious justice, very much going back to John Locke, prohibit and rules of justice prohibiting the infringement of those rights are the only means of guaranteeing liberty. Accordingly, Hayek argues that no sense can be made of the meaning of the phrase social justice, since it demands us to legislate in the service of particular interests. Another problem is that it becomes unclear what society is or is not responsible for, and thus the question of who to petition for the rectification of social injustices becomes murky. So he will talk a lot about, we tend to think a lot more about economic justice and social injustice based on historical events. Hayek wasn't necessarily thinking about that. He was thinking also just about natural disasters, economic disasters, things which are completely unplanned, unpredictable, and to whom no fault can be attributed. And so the question for Hayek is when faced by the general tragedies of life, is that an issue of justice? And Hayek would say no, justice applies only to intentional human actions, not really to unintended consequences and not really to natural incidents. And so not ruling out the ability of government to and a private assembly of citizens to assist one another in charity, but the specific issue at play is whether this is something people have a right to apply for. And his answer is couched in this language of general and particular. We get this distinction which complicates it between spontaneous order and organizations. Government is an organization because it has been constructed. So we've mentioned that as well. And I've mentioned this also. This is the model constitution, the separation of the legislative and the government assembly. he feels basically that the confusion of those two tasks of articulating general rules of conduct and of administrating for particular things, if they get muddied, you get what he called like a para-government of organised interests. You get lobby groups. You get a lot of promises made behind the scenes. If you vote for me, I'll make sure this bill is passed with these conditions and so on and so forth. And for him, that is the road to totalitarianism, the road to serfdom. And so his objective is to get clear what is liberty, what is justice, what are the conditions that permit liberty, so keeping the legislature general. All confusion about the decay of language, democracy and the decay of language. So the idea of social justice behind is an empty term for reasons I've described. And we talked about all that. Okay. So as usual, we normally just leave some questions if people want to ponder those. But we already have quite a interesting point to jump into, I think, with general and particular, if we want to discuss that some more, if anyone has any clarifying questions for the moment. After the social media.
Yeah.
Very good, very good.
So is general the same as universalizable?
Yes, yes.
Is universalizable an empiric statement or empirical statement?
Could you expand on that?
In the sense that it could be implemented globally across humanity, whatever.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Or is something natural to humans and universal amongst humans, or something?
It's to do with sort of, I guess, establishing the condition that it can apply to as many instances in the future as possible. So we're not. It's not. The laws aren't going to be positive in that they're waiting for such and such circumstances to fall into place in a specific way, or to respond to particular moments in history, as it were. They're going to establish general conditions, and once people feel that they're in that kind of a situation, such as I've suffered an injustice, I applied for this service with this contractor, he gave me this contract, he said he would provide me these services, and he has not delivered. I'm now in a general situation where I can now apply for compensation.
So it's rule based. There may be,
yeah.
because I can see that anything universalized will have an exception.
Yeah,
probably.
yeah.
So it's not universal in that sort of Kantian sense. So it's something that on the basis of which, for which rules can be derived and applied.
Yeah, it does refer to it as the nomos, doesn't it? So there is the
Kantian. There is a distinction between.
He's Kantian. No, in the sense of critique of practical reason. He's against that. He's according to the critique of the what was it of judgment, but what kind of a judgment was?
And the kind of
the third critique. He's using the conceptual apparatus from the third critique, not from the second. So Rawls is the one who is following the second critique in a like a new modern way. And but with Hayek, it's the third critique, and it's like the belief in the self-organizing systems in a modern language. That is not Kantian, but he cites Kant.
He does
from the third critique.
Right. Yeah. I noticed that Hayek was sort of almost ambiguous about the categorical imperative, which you get in the second critique. So he had a vague interest in what Kant was trying to do there, but I don't think as you said, I don't think he follows through.
I haven't been through any of these texts for decades.
Yeah.
So,
No,
I'm
no,
just
that's right.
recalling.
Yeah. So Kant is an influential figure on Hayek in precisely this way. But
Probably the most critical, the most like influential.
I would say so. But then I felt that Hayek, although in the literature he's described as a Kantian, I felt he was more of an empiricist.
You can make easily a lot of analogies with Hume or work, even with walk, but actually he's like in the German-speaking tradition.
Yes.
So it's quite different.
Yeah. Maybe. Are you going to have something?
No, well, no, I think I'd let you go if you want to ask a question, Jack. If you've got a certain point you'd like to raise, then I'll jump in.
I guess I'd like to understand a bit more about the difference between what you see in those two critiques for general.
Well, they have like different objectives.
Yeah.
In Kant,
right.
specifically.
Okay.
In the first critique, Kant is considered with how we know.
Yes.
So it's quite a big theme, and probably we can go in it on different occasions. Then in the second, he's asking the question how the moral world is possible, and he answers that. So here is his ethics.
Yep.
And even this political stuff, it's included here somehow. But in the third critique, that the main objective is aesthetics, as the German call it, like what's beautiful and sublime.
Yes.
Then in the second part, he goes to explain how the nature is. I speak about Kant now. So exactly that second part of this third critique, he is like bringing all this stuff that happened to be extremely influential in the German idealism that comes after Kant.
Yeah.
Like Fichte, it's the main figure there, but Hegel is the most famous.
Okay.
And Hayek is in this tradition as well, but he is empiricist, as you can say that he's not idealist.
Yeah.
But he believes in the spontaneous order, and he constructs the society and the economy out of it. He's mostly an economist as a colleague, as a profession. Yeah. So there are many interesting details to see how all of this is done on these grounds as a spontaneous order. And is it just order? I'm convinced that he doesn't believe that. If you hear people who speak about the so-called neoliberals, and they count him like a founding father, he doesn't match this image at all.
No.
But still, people speak about it. Mainly the so-called progressive intellectuals.
Yes.
And so we can discuss these details because they're quite interesting.
Yes.
And very relevant to today.
Definitely.
To nowadays discussions.
I'd like to talk a bit about that more. Do you have some thoughts about that?
I think, obviously that differentiation between what is it, nomos and thesis that he makes. And the nomos is obviously the spontaneous order that you chaps have been discussing. And that goes back to our kind of discussions of Burke in terms of this kind of organic development of what's it called? Not statute law, common law, and the way that fetishization of the English old tradition of kind of common law evolving naturally and fusing with changes over time that we can adapt and make, rather than the thesis, which is the process of legislation making that he's seeing in the more centralized authoritarian countries. I suppose he's still saying that obviously legislation making is something different to the nomos. So I don't think he's excluding it and saying everything that's ideal is nomos. I think he's still accepting.
They work together.
Yeah, exactly. But if you solely focus on the thesis, then that's where it goes wrong, because then, as we were saying earlier about the kind of gridization of Franz, Burke, etc., if you only focus on the process of legislation, you're abstracted from what's going on the ground, the actual practical, issues that you need to adapt and change to. And as you were saying, Ruben, I certainly, as far as I'm concerned, because this copy, for example, The Road to Serfdom, I'm just jotting some notes down in. When I read The Road to Serfdom, I certainly didn't see him in the vein of a kind of Milton Friedman sort of neoliberal, because he makes
He's
space.
very close to Mises.
Yes.
He makes space for market failure. Even he talks about you wouldn't have roads if you were solely relying on businesses and organisations to determine where infrastructure was going to go. The infrastructure would only supply factories. You'd have a road from your house to the factory you work at, and that would be it. You wouldn't have vital infrastructure to get to other places. So there are things where, when the market fails, the state needs to step in. But again, it's organic. It's like, where do we practically work?
It fails by necessity as well.
Yeah.
Because when he discussed, for example, the business cycle, maybe he was calling it a trade cycle, I don't remember, but he has certainly books specifically dedicated on this subject. He sees it, something that happens inevitably. So, and he tries to explain how the market mechanism actually leads to it. So it comes in a contradiction with the view where you can believe that the market is the solution for all things human. It is not. So here is a place for intervention from the state once again.
Exactly. And it's the excessive amount of legislation that obviously he's really taking issue with. And because he says, doesn't he, the history of government, control of economic life is a history of the progressive restriction of liberty. Over time, we're just regressing essentially in the name of progress. But Jack, if you want to.
That's one thing I had neglected to mention. There is definitely for Hayek a role of important role of correcting previous errors, but my understanding is that is always seen in the context of human imperfection. So there is sort of or perhaps this is a misinterpretation. Are the rules of just conduct, the implicit sort of rules that structure society and structure all interaction, are they platonic forms for Hayek? Are they unchanging? And is it just that there's always human error in trying to approximate what is unchanging? Or are they actually changing? I guess because he is modelling himself after Darwin, after all, and so it's more probable that they are unchanging. So it's not just correction of human error, but like genuine adaptation that the legislature has to be ready for. So there is a creative element to the state. So it's not just continually working against its own corruption, as it were. It has positive challenges to meet.
And there certainly are
challenges.
Forgive me. There certainly are challenges in his day that were particularly, obviously earlier. Obviously, this is in the 70s, which is also facing similar challenges, which again is a massive piece of context for the expanse of his writing. The fact that he's writing in the Second World War and then he's writing in the 70s, and when he's writing earlier, he's writing at a time where Germany's had an inflation level that's peaked in, I think, 1923. It's peaked at around 29,500%. So you can see the issue of monetary policy that he's sort of like looking at and going, well, this clearly isn't working. And then by the time of when he's writing this, you've got similar issues. You've got obviously the sort of failure of the Bretton Woods system, the gold standard falling apart. You've got all of these sort of things which are starting to replace, and no wonder he's even more worried when he's penning the work we're looking at today. But sorry, Jack.
suppose we could get into some of the details about what he actually proposes in the model constitution. Maybe there are some disagreements there. As I walk through, were people able to read much of that, of the text?
Which
Okay.
text is it?
This was a chapter on the model constitution that he proposed. Okay, so we talk a bit about that. So it begins with a description of what a constitution is, basically. Beginning with a basic clause about restraint or coercion being committed only in line with the recognised rules of just conduct. The role of government not yet being defined. Basically trying to introduce into the idea of a constitution what we just described, this ability to adapt. So the purpose of a constitution isn't going to be to give you all the rights that you're ever going to know. It's to give you the structure to enumerate more rights in the future. And the basic benchmark against which they're going to be measured, make sure they're general and not serve particular interest. Maybe that's something we could discuss a bit more. You had a critique of the distinction between general and particular interest. Could you maybe think a bit more about where you think that goes wrong?
Yes, I'm looking at it from the point of view of how he seems to make decisions about what should be general, what should be particular.
Yeah.
And it's not clear to me that his perspective is somehow superior to that of governments or individuals to make that difference. So it's more about the perspective he's coming from and any consistency between that and what he's saying government shouldn't do, more than anything. So how does he get to specify certain things are general, other than maybe an empirical basis? And I haven't thought about it in terms of as a holistic, self-reproducing, self-organizing system. So I don't know how that fits in. Maybe he's got some idea on that. But that was really what I was struggling with.
Right.
I might just be more general. I tend to, when I read philosophy, I tend to see where the philosopher brings in the external things from their life, from the society they're in, that shape their philosophy and aren't necessarily argued for in the book or in the thing. So I struggle with that being a good basis on which to have a philosophy.
Yeah, and for Hayek, that's clearly the rise of totalitarianism that he saw that grew up. I guess he was the young man by the time this was all changing around him, but and seeing all the ways that governments sort of perhaps tried and failed to be particularly hands-on. Okay.
I would certainly agree. What's your name again? Sorry. Bruce.
Yeah.
I
put the Simon earlier, so it's okay.
I was only going to make a very small point, which is that for someone who's so against authoritarianism, it's funny that to justify the system in the ideal constitution, he draws on Plato.
Yeah, right.
I find that quite funny, the idea of the assembly of guardians, and to say that you're this kind of libertarian thinker, and then you have an assembly of guardians in the vein of Plato, the sort of the ideal republic, the epitome of a text that that some historians say from the Republic through to Nazi Germany and centralized Soviet powers is the kind of ground, the sort of bedrock of political philosophy leading up to authoritarianism. Is it the upper house that's the assembly of guardians, and the lower house is the assembly of sort of regular kind of business assembly?
Yes.
And I do see continuing my point, I guess, I do see how he's trying to kind of bridge the divide by saying that the assembly of guardians will be this kind of one that philosopher kings or whatever are sitting around thinking, do they fit with general laws, and the lower house will be the ones who are actually making the practical kind of localized decisions. What is it called, the lower house? The assembly of...
in Plato or in Hayek?
Hayek.
In Hayek. The lower house, the the Legislative Assembly.
Yeah, hasn't it got some?
Or the Club of Contemporaries.
Something along those lines. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Well, it's sort of a general assembly, isn't it? Which would be responsible for the day-to-day on the kind of more localized issues, as we were saying, and then the upper house would be this kind of philosophizing chamber.
Yes.
But on a practical level, I'm not sure how quickly this sort of market-efficient system would actually operate that he's drawing out.
Possibly not so great. I mean, he does talk a little bit about having to pass off roles to the government if the legislative branch is too slow.
Yeah.
Perhaps something similar would happen there. What do you think of his strategy of getting people involved in the government through this way? His discussion of the sort of age-based groups through society and recruiting people from there and getting them involved in political affairs.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. It's very lock-in the sense that the active citizenry, I found, this idea that everyone does have a responsibility to kind of engage their faculties to get involved, and he feels that that's why you need this localized politics, because otherwise, if everything's away from you on the ground, you're going to withdraw yourself as an agent and not be interested in those kind of peer-to-peer political discourses.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I do like that, and I mean, I'm very even as someone sort of centre-left politically, I've always been quite taken by a lot of this, because I was saying to you before, I can even see parallels with the existentialists that we were discussing last week when it came to someone like Camus, in terms of wanting to critique, obviously, authoritarianism, as he did in Bread and Freedom that we were discussing, as well as the West, unlike Sartre and de Beauvoir. And I think Hayek is as well, because he's saying, these systems, even our current systems, as much as they've originated organically, there's a lot to be desired in terms of actually getting people involved in, as you're saying, in that age bracketed sort of system. But maybe you could sort of explore the age bracketed system in more detail if you return later.
I'll find him here. Let's see.
Please go the early stage.
Okay, yeah, no worries. Clubs of contemporaries might be well formed, either at school-leaving age or at least when each class entered public life, say at the age of 18. They would possibly be more attractive if men of one age group were brought together with women 2 years or so younger. This might be achieved by allowing men and women at the age of 18 to join either
That's my case.
to join the then newly formed club or one of those formed ones that were taken 2 or 3 years. Such a choice would, of course, imply that those opting for the higher age class would permanently belong to delegate and be eligible as delegates and representatives earlier than what was likely the case. The clubs would, by bringing together the contemporaries of all social classes and preserving contact between those who were together at school, provide a truly democratic link by serving to provide contact, cutting across all of the stratifications of providing an education in and incentive for interest in public institutions as well as training in parliamentary procedures. They would also provide a regular channel for the expression of dissent of those not yet represented in a legislative assembly. If they should occasionally also become platforms for party debates, their advantage would be that those leaning towards different parties would be induced to discuss the issues together and would become conscious that they had a common task of representing the outlook of their generation and to qualify for possible later public service. Very interesting. It's almost like he sees it as like a safe space to misappropriate a word that's popular for the kind of factions which he fears get the legislative and the government sort of mixed up. So if you have this sort of I guess this cultural institution of sort of age-based associations, and they have their common grievances, let's say, by age. They're in the forum for dissent, they're in the forum for debate. I guess it's probably like a socially regulated sort of democratic outlet, as it were, with advantages potentially of giving a certain degree of regulation to the public conversation.
And being a backstop against sort of the tyranny of the majority.
Yeah,
that
right.
Discussed. Because that's another thing that he is obviously terrified of, this idea that even in a functioning democracy, the majority will just decide everything against the minority. And as much as you said, he's not interested in kind of like focusing on particularities, on what I suppose what we call sort of what is it that Trump doesn't like, positive action or affirmative action. Yeah. As much as he wouldn't want that, he is very wary that like minority groups, in terms of like minority interests, could be squeezed out simply by the size of a tyranny of the majority, and that's why he pushes in the direction of a more federalised system. As we love to, or at least I love to discuss, he's got this fetishisation of the Swiss model, which sort of a canton federalised system, or the US as well in terms of its federal system. But yeah, all of these elements I think are very much a backstop against one overall majority dominating the political discourse of the day.
Okay. You see similarities with the Swiss cantons and what Hayek proposes?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. And would you say it's an effective regulator against corporate interests?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay. For what reason precisely?
I think there's two elements, aren't there? There's obviously the simple kind of truncating of sort of size, which is very simple, but also like Jane and we were discussing in terms of actually pushing it down to ground level and engaging those people in the discourse is simply by its nature means that people feel more responsibility, feel more engaged, and therefore that is a backstop to complete majoritarian sort of overreach over smaller interests, I'd say, because people are, due to the localization of politics, wanting to be more engaged because they're, it talks about this in The Road to Serfdom as well, about how the one issue with democracy in history has been that it's not wanted to be local, and actually the most one just great one that stimulate the discourse within local communities to draw them in and want to discuss these things and want to debate these things. Obviously, yes, you still need to have his, which I still find quite funny, his assembly of guardians that will ultimately sit at the top and make sure that it doesn't fall outside the general framework. But yeah, I think he is very much drawing on the Swiss as well.
Another aspect of his constitution is voluntary government. He thinks that's very important because one of the primary reasons that these things get muddled up is partly because you're going to try and think about how to keep things separate, but then people are going to be on the payroll of government ultimately. And so it was important for Hayek to envision a group of people who participated in the running of government affairs voluntarily. Has any of the political writer considered that?
In terms of what?
Having a body of people who I guess operate in government out of charity.
City of London.
Ah, okay.
Lord Mayor is a volunteer role.
Yeah, right.
Then again, the City of London is plutocracy. And
Well,
it's all
so
connected to the big business. The ideology behind
I guess voluntarism is slightly sort of in the vein of sort of anarchic thinkers in the kind of late 19th century.
Right. So did he get that from Robert Nozick?
Potentially. I'm trying to think if anyone else kind of directly used the term voluntarism. Sort of, in terms of making up a sort of separate assembly or
Good question.
It feels very culture bound. It doesn't feel quite like a political thing. So I would imagine through the ages there have been people who are unpaid for their political or their governmental roles. But that would have been coming out of a culture of whatever other values are in place.
Well, famously, England until the sort of mid 1920s, MPs. I think what 18.
It was about the 1800s when most people weren't paid until voluntary.
And that was done on the basis that there wouldn't be corruption.
I mean, the idea being is that they will landed gentry to represent you.
But even with that aside, the idea was that you would be focusing on it without having a sort of without pay, you would sort of be there as a kind of advisor. You wouldn't be thinking of your career. You'd be thinking of, I'm there to make a kind of ambivalent decision, essentially.
There's an assumed social status in being that person, being able to be that person.
Well, exactly.
They were doing science in the same way. It was a gentleman's science. People were not paid to be academics or whatever. They were just doing it for the sake of the truth. In this case, it can be for the sake of justice. In the political sense.
And also some. I mean, ironically, something Hayek probably wouldn't particularly like, but some of the kind of Scandinavian social democratic models bring in people almost on a kind of basis of even if you're outside of Parliament, they will bring in external individuals from business, from finance as advisors on a kind of voluntary basis to say, well, you've got the expertise, you're based in this country, therefore you have a sort of semi-obligation to the state, but if you would like to use your skills to advise government sort of thing, bring them in that way. But that's obviously more the left-wing sort of style of government, but were there any other questions in particular, Jack, that you wanted to discuss, from what?
I was interested in what was new in his constitution. Maybe in relation to some of the previous ones we've discussed. So you brought up Rousseau, sort of some similarities there.
And also, could I just ask one question? How would you define, as this is part of our Liberty series, how would you define his vision of what a kind of true liberty would be? But you can think about that and go through the question you were just about to raise.
But I guess we've been discussing my question, but it was just to sort of articulate it more formally. If there were any particular things that jumped out at you when you read this, for me it was the age thing. Is that in Locke also? Or a vague? I don't think I came across. I thought that was quite.
What is it? What do
we call it? The stratification of society by ages and getting them to participate in the democracy at various levels and organising it that way.
Any idea about age stratification?
Kind of.
Just the active citizenry element was all I was thinking.
Right.
See the parallel.
You can see general parallels. Okay, great. Okay. And so you were asking about
his actual conception of liberty. What would you say, Jack, as the Hayek passionato? What would you say his vision of liberty is for the future?
He's a classic advocate of negative liberty, negative freedom. There's a remarkable passage at the end of this volume where he describes liberty as something that is, like Locke, something that matures, something that grows through the development of man. As you drew a quote from the Road to Certain, which is the same idea, that as the society becomes more sophisticated, and the needs of people to operate in this increasingly complex whole develop, the need for more and more delegation, I guess, of responsibility, the delegation of resource management is demanded, because the whole thing becomes far too big for one man to handle. So the chief virtue of liberty is because it's the critical ingredient in the perpetuation of society, which is an organic perpetuation, a self-perpetuation.
On this point, this is very counterintuitive, I guess, but do you not think that for someone who's such a champion or a stalwart against authoritarianism and sort of a champion of liberty, is there not a slight irony in some of the ways that he phrases things in this? Now, let me just read you a passage, one of the ones that I jotted down. The chief evil is unlimited democracy, which has become a threat to individual freedom by enabling temporary majorities to impose their will in ways which may be irrevocable. Now, obviously, when we look at him in the context of what we've been discussing, you can understand why he's saying that. He's saying it out of a context of the Weimar Republic has fallen in his earlier life to, the state of emergency, or the sort of clause in the Weimar Constitution which allows for a state of exception, written up by Carl Schmitt. He's seen Soviet democracy in a sense of, from 1917, the idea that ultimately a democracy can fail and an authoritarian government can arise even from a democracy. He's looking at cases like Britain and he's saying, oh, well, that democracy is going, they were only spending, before the war, 4% GDP on public spending, and then by, obviously, Attlee's time, they're spending about a quarter of all government spending on state services. But for someone who should be surely we see him as an ardent defender of democracy, is there not a paradox in the sense that everything he's saying is saying democracy is flawed? Everything he's, if you read this text and said, oh, by the way, he's a real defender of democracy, and you read this text and came out of it, I don't think you'd come away thinking things democracy is great. I think he seems to be saying actually the democratic system that we've seen for the last few decades doesn't work.
That's a very good question. So he's very aware of it, because he has 2 chapters in this devoted to a very short synopsis and a much bigger synopsis, kind of democracy and its discontent kind of thing. That's not the official title, but what are the issues? The confusion of the 2 distinct functions in government, the moral confusion, decay of language, para-government, which is sort of the government of covert interests, has too much liberty, let all this go wrong. This is the eternal tension that we have when we talk about even Hayek, when Hayek talks about liberty as this chief ingredient to keeping the organic whole of society operating, he has a particular idea, and I think you've been gesturing toward, Bruce, about what that will look like, and what will be necessary to keep people using their freedoms well, as it were, to keep in Rousseau, it's sort of the question of the continued moral improvement, moral sustenance of the people. In other things, it's about education. For me, what I've learned from this is that the 2 are inseparable. The idea that we're going to keep freedom, so we're going to keep government limited to enable people certain liberties, there's always a hint of what those liberties are for. So the freedom from, freedom for that we've discussed in previous sessions is inseparable. And as a philosopher, I'm interested in sort of an analogous problem to this, another way of putting it, which perhaps you might appreciate, but it's this sort of this problem of value neutrality. And the literature has been very critical of Hayek on this point. Hayek seems. Sorry?
Max Weber.
Yes, exactly. So it's
probably not him.
No, so you often read Hayek, or Hayek presents himself as someone who has attained a vantage point of neutrality instead of a pattern in liberal thinking, or at least in classical liberalism. Whereas he does have very definitive values about the role of government, the role of what individuals should be getting up to. He tries to keep that as abstract as possible, and I think that is legitimate. But he does still think that there should be this that there is value in this spontaneous order. The question that was emerging through social movements in the 60s and 70s, and even to the present day, is that spontaneous order actually neutral, or morally neutral, or is what people might describe as systematic injustices in the spontaneity of that order? Hayek does a sleight of hand where he says that question is not admissible.
It's interesting because actually moral neutrality is just one of many ways in which that system can be measured. It doesn't need to be morally neutral. The moral position is often invisible. And therefore the people inside that system aren't aware of the moral compromises.
Exactly. I think that's much more descriptive of Hayek. And in the second reading, which we selected, where he presents much more richly his view of where values come from, where the kind of values that animate society come from, through like a very specific variant of evolution, which isn't genetic evolution, which is more Darwinian, which is bottom up, but like a continuous implicit dialogue between man and the world, through like a legitimate selection based on trial and error, with the idea that the action comes before the understanding.
But this analogy with Darwin, it's not direct. The thing is because the society is not like an organism. It can be like visualized as an organism, but it's not exactly organism. In order it to be a real organism, it needs to be organized in itself with this spontaneous order. But to have a spontaneous order there, you need like a social mediation. Where he is a specialist in the economic realm, he uses money for that. And even money are not like perfect by itself mediator. Here you need to. There is no really monetary policy in Hayek, but you need to be careful. You need to make sure that the money serves its function as a mediator. Because if it doesn't, often it doesn't serve it. And then you have crisis, and you have immediately after that crashes in the market cycle. So the money here is quite important. It's like a crucial mediator by which you have the economy as a functioning one, as a self-organizing organism. And if you make the analogy now to the society at large, you can see that there are other mediation alongside the money. They're like the law, the language, and the political system. So if you keep them really to be a good mediator, social mediators, which perform their function, then you're going to have self-organizing society. As you manage to do it with the economy. And I think this solves the problem, all the problems for him. It is how he sees the society as self-organizing. But you need to keep in mind the mediators all the time. If they don't serve their function, then you have problems in society. It is, if you have problems with the money, you have economic cycle. If you have problems with legislation or the executive powers or with the language, then you have problems in the society as a whole.
But also, if it's self-organizing, then you have the question of, think about the Darwinianism of when is that self-organizing requires selection.
Yes.
So when does it need to self-organize in a way where certain groups of people, whatever it is, need to be selected out in order for the society to then have a further.
In the Darwinian viewpoint, you don't have a mediator.
Yeah.
Like in the social system, you have to go through a mediator because you don't have organism there, actual organism.
Yeah.
So,
but the mediation could be the shared reality that comes with being a cognitive being that looks at the experiences of society, the experiences of my psychological.
Yeah, they're cultural facts.
Yeah.
Like language.
Yeah.
The basic thing for him.
Yeah.
Money, of course, fundamental, and then the political system, and probably the values. But with the values, it's much more difficult to think it. In the organism, that is the main concern of Darwinism. Here you don't have anything effect. And Darwin is actually not concerned with the social reality. It is Herbert Spencer after him who is making the transition to the society.
Yeah.
But you have some kind of self-organizing system there in Herbert Spencer, but it's a bit different. We need to go and to see the details. It's the analogy and work of making.
Successful cultures survive, though. That's certainly, I think, something Hayek would agree with, this kind of Darwinian meta idea.
Probably you get dysfunctional cultures as well.
Yeah.
If you use this kind of language.
Yeah.
A successful one is a well-functioning.
Yeah.
But even the dysfunctional culture does have a reality.
But the culture of common law, for example, that's something that's built up over time. That's where I can see an influence of Darwin, but not directly, not in the sense of kind of like a practical application, but within the cultural dynamic of, say, a common law system, there's a Darwinian element. But obviously, trying to draw on this too much, he does raise something about most things happen in the law of liberty. He does raise something about how a lot of things happen to man by accident, and a lot of things aren't actually by his own intention. That's about the only passage that I'd say does feel like it's drawn from Darwin, which is kind of like a lot of these things happen by accident, and then we respond to them and get better. That actually man's intention often isn't, and because he's obviously being skeptical of people's intentions. If there's a central plan, what are their intentions? A lot of these things that happen to us and maybe even benefit us happen by accident, not by intentional decision making. So that's probably the only passage I would say that I saw that I think relates almost directly to Darwin. Other than that, it sort of sits as a kind of creative milieu. And we're bricoleurs, so we're building to throw in a bit of Derrida, as I like to do in every single thing that we've ever done, Jack. We are bricoleurs. We have to pick up from what we've received to be able to then build on the next kind of step.
So in what you say, so the legislature that is very Darwinian.
I guess so.
Yeah. I guess I would make the case more for Hayek that a bit more can be drawn from Darwin. So the general particular distinction, I can sort of understand where that comes from, because you might ask, well, why is it that Darwinian selection would not serve particular interests? And, now, part of what you might say in defense of Hayek is that the maximal service will come when you start to see the patterns beyond this particular interaction you've had with your environment, see how that can be reproduced across time, and so it's when you become aware of those more general principles for conduct, that's when you are maybe at a greater advantage, because you can abstract more from the present moment, and that has unbelievable advantage cognitively, and just frees you up a bit, so you're not locked in that present moment. That might be where he gets the general particular distinction from, but morally speaking, a lot has been said about the incompatibility of evolution and ethics, and a lot of people have pointed to the fact that there's no reason why you could get a general ethic from particular self-serving environment. It's not, maybe that's not the right way to approach. Maybe it's just simply to say that Darwinian evolution is amoral.
Yeah.
And Hayek sort of knows that, because he reduces morality to just pragmatics. He doesn't distinguish virtue from morality. Virtue is just skill, competency, and so that's partly where the disguised morality comes from that you mentioned, Bruce. It's because Hayek's not interested in that. Justice is a practical question.
Yeah. In the end, he buried his ethics in the book, and pronounced it as a framework within which to understand universalization, which is fine, because actually every writer will do that.
Yes,
but that is what it is. It is not neutral.
Exactly. There is another connection which doesn't come strictly from Darwin.
Yeah, but it can be. It can be the morality can be a result of the interaction of all the individuals in the society. That is beyond any one of them.
Absolutely, absolutely agree. Yeah, and
but it's valid for this society at this particular moment.
And that's a stronger foundation than Hayek's interpretation of what that morality should be.
I think he's inclined to take it in this way.
Okay. I haven't read it, so I actually don't know. So.
It is a result of this complex disorder, but it can be disrupted by malfunctioning mediators like language or an intervening government.
Yeah. Just imbalances generally, any imbalance could disrupt it.
Yeah, but at the same time, all of these, they have the function to facilitate the interaction of all these individuals which belong to the group. At least I'm inclined to see him in this way. Otherwise, this entire disorder is not even possible.
Yeah.
Do you think, going off on a completely different direction, but do you think that the period in which he's writing this, so we're starting around 73, aren't we?
73.
Yeah. Obviously, you've had British decolonialism, you've had the war in Algiers in France, you've had territories being handed back over, but all of them are calamitous for a decade through the 60s. Whilst social progressive movements are happening in the West, this kind of calamitous kind of like attempt to either semi-maintain or do you think, and perhaps this is a question we can end on because we're getting to time, and I just wondered because I do think it must be influencing him because he's a very bright man. I'll give him that. And the decade he's coming out of when he's writing this, he must be aware that one of the things that proves that this sort of artificial government that he's critiquing is fundamentally flawed is this calamitous attempt to try and maintain or sort of slowly withdraw from various countries. Obviously, the Vietnam War as well, but the kind of, the British Empire, this kind of slow sort of like, oh, well, maybe we'll maintain this, and then kind of like just falling apart, like no idea really what's going on the ground. Do you think that's got a heavy influence on the way he's writing this? Because that's something we haven't mentioned so far in terms of the historical context. And those themes are so vibrant within the kind of political discourse of what he's writing.
Yeah, but he's no different early in the 30s.
Yeah.
So he's just continuing to do his thing.
Yeah,
That's it.
Yeah, the only difference between
There is a huge debate in the 20s and 30s. Can you regulate? It's mainly economic. Can you regulate the economic life? And really solve the social problems in this way?
But this text, compared to The Road to Serfdom, feels like it's more talking about the failures of Western governments as well as authoritarian governments. So obviously, The Road to Serfdom is talking about the danger of authoritarianism.
Yeah, because after the Second World War, you have socialism, democratic socialism in the West.
But this feels like
not earlier than that.
The critiques of Western governments and very much artificial government, the kind of like sitting back and kind of going, oh yes, we know what's going on. I think this kind of like desperate kind of end of colonialism in the 60s and early 70s surely is having an impact on what he's writing, wouldn't you?
I hadn't considered it. It presents analogous problems to economic management, because social management, as it were. You bring Western.
He's just something arguments. He's doing the same thing. But the fact is, in the 20s, in the 30s, this side of the argument was, and then it was considered that you can organize a state which is centrally planned, and you can solve the problems, economic problems of societies, and from here all the problems, social problems. But he admits they continue to argue that it is not the case, and they go through these few decades. They argue against the social democratic policies, which you see implemented in Western Europe. And then that comes in the late 70s with the change of government here in Britain and in America, and they're on the winning side.
But I just wonder whether he's shifting his critique, because like as far as I can see it, the West in that 60s period is trying to do what fundamentally he is against, which is maintaining this kind of economic vision. France and Algeria trying to maintain a kind of centrally planned economy based on the economic realities of France in Algeria. And Britain's doing the same thing, sort of trying to maintain these kind of like areas. And they're all falling apart. Like it's very clear, it's every day. It's very clear they're falling apart.
Case studies which I could have drawn. There's no reference to these.
No, I'm not saying there are, but I think it must be.
But there is more over-regulation in Britain where he lived and he experienced it. And then in the late 70s and through the 80s, you have the deregulation. So that goes his way. So if you need to see something that is in his life and motivates his argument, it is experience in Britain and America.
I think that's a great place to.
A perfect place to end.
Since we're at the 7:30 mark. Thank you all for coming, for contributing.
Thank you very much. It's been probably the most vibrant discussion, I'd say. Don't you say, Michelle, from your experience of the last ones?
Hey, I took my notes.
I've got food for thought to go home with.
No, wonderful. And I hope we'll see all of you again for rules that presenting.
So this
I cannot do it.
Oh, brilliant. It'll be recorded though, so you'll be able to access it if you so desire. But on Thursday. Perfect.
He's very influential.
Very much so, yes.
You'll have to show me how to.
Fantastic. Thank you to everyone online, and we'll be ending now. Thank you.